Have you ever imagined an old man living alone in the forest, becoming the only human a Bigfoot would ever protect? In the early 1990s, deep within the Sawtooth Mountains near Stanley, Idaho, a 73-year-old man named Harlan Wicks quietly tended to a life of solitude. His only family, a ginger cat named Pumpkin. But one snowstorm night, something unbelievable happened. An injured Bigfoot collapsed at his doorstep. Instead of slamming the door, Harlan let her in. And what happened next shattered everything we think we know about monsters. This wasn't a mindless beast. She remembered kindness. She learned the rules of his home. She showed restraint, even when her instincts screamed otherwise. All because one man chose compassion over fear, and a cat was called family. This story isn't just about a legend. It's about morality, redemption, and the power of choosing not to harm, even when you could. Dear viewer, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? What's your name? And how far can this story travel, if you believe it's one worth sharing? If this touched something in your heart, tap that like button and consider subscribing. Let's build a community where Bigfoot isn't feared, but felt. A space where we believe in gentle giants, and even gentler choices. From my screen to yours, warmest regards, always. The wind carried the smell of pine needles and cold stone. It pushed through the canyons of the Sawtooth like a quiet warning, curling around the ridges and slipping between the cracks in the weathered cedar boards of a cabin that hadn't seen a guest in 5 years. Smoke rose in a single thread from the stovepipe chimney, pale and tired against the slate sky. The forest had gone gold, then gray. Now it waited, just like the man inside. Harlan Wicks set the kettle back on the stovetop without looking. His hand knew the distance by heart. So did the creak of the old wood under his boots, the soft scrape of the chair legs as he slid one back and sat down slow. Outside, the wind rattled the edge of the tin roof, a high, lonely whistle. He didn't flinch. He just reached for the stubby pencil and the notebook that always lived to the left of the salt tin, one page at a time, always with the date first, always in cursive, like he'd been taught before the war he was too young for. October 29th, 1992. Wind from the north. Sky pale, sore in the knees. Pumpkin caught a bird again. Let it go this time. He paused, pencil hovering, looked over the words. They didn't say much, but that was all right. Not every page needed to be profound. Some just needed to be true. The orange tabby stretched near the iron stove, tail flicking lazily. Her spot never changed, right where the warmth pooled. She gave a long, theatrical yawn before curling tighter into herself, her body shaped like a comma on the old braided rug. Harlan looked at her, said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved a little, like a man halfway to remembering something good. The back door still groaned on its hinges, no matter how many times he oiled them. This morning, it had jammed again, so he'd gone out with his toolkit, muttering to himself, checking the frame. The forest crouched against the edges of his clearing, pine dark and watchful. No birdsong. He noticed that, but didn't say it out loud. Some silences weren't meant to be disturbed. The screwdriver slipped. He cursed under his breath, then stood up, rubbed the cold out of his fingers, and stared at the trees a while. Something wasn't right. The ground felt off. Not dangerous, not yet. Just shifted, like a bed after someone's left it. When he turned to go back inside, his eyes snagged on the coat, hanging on the nail by the window. His breath caught. He hadn't touched that coat in 6 winters. Wool, forest green, buttons gone dark with age. His hand reached for it before he could stop himself. Just a finger brushed the fabric. Then it stopped, frozen in midair. No, not today. A crunch of gravel, quick footsteps. Harlan turned. "Mr. Wicks." Bo Ramirez's voice cracked on the Wicks part like it always did. 12 years old and full of gangly limbs that hadn't figured out how to move right yet. The boy was out of breath. His bike half dropped near the porch. Harlan didn't say much, just raised an eyebrow. Waited. "There's a hinge busted on our chicken coop door," Bo said. "Mama said you'd know how to fix it." Harlan grunted. "Not yes, not no." Bo looked at the porch, then at Pumpkin. "It's gonna freeze tonight." Harlan grabbed his gloves from the hook. "Let's go." He didn't ask why the boy had come alone. Didn't ask why the sheriff wasn't the one fixing things, or the boy's uncle, or any of the other able-bodied men in Stanley. He just rode in the back of the pickup, Bo's bike rattling in the bed, the sky already darkening like a bruise. When the hinge was fixed and the boy offered him a dented thermos of cocoa, Harlan said, "Don't go deep into those woods after the weather turns." "I won't," Bo promised, too fast to be sure. Harlan looked at him a second longer, then nodded once. That night, back at the cabin, the stove hissed steady. Pumpkin twitched in her sleep. Harlan poured water for tea. The wind had picked up. Low branches scratched the siding. He rubbed his thumb against a knot in the table's edge, worn smooth from decades of habits. A knock. No, not a knock. A sound from outside. A weight. Something brushing near the woodpile. Then nothing. He grabbed the flashlight, slipped the latch. The beam cut through the dark in a shaky line. At first, he saw nothing. Then he saw it. A footprint. Large, too large, pressed into the muddy edge where the woodpile met the clearing, but not pointed toward the house. It had veered, subtly, carefully, around the sunspot where Pumpkin always lay in the morning. He stared at it. No man would have done that. No bear would have even noticed. The hair on his arms rose. He backed into the cabin, shut the door, locked it out of habit, then stood there a moment longer, holding the flashlight like a relic. The next morning, just after sunrise, he found something new. It wasn't a gift, not in the way people might think. Near the far edge of the clearing, just where the tall ferns began, lay a hunk of torn venison. Not clean. No knife had touched it. It looked like something had been ripped apart, then left. Not for kindness, but to see what he'd do. He didn't touch it. Pumpkin didn't either. Instead, she sat at the windowsill all day, eyes fixed on the tree line. Her tail flicked once, then stilled. By nightfall, she wouldn't come inside. Just sat on the porch like a sentinel, ears twitching, back arched against the quiet. Harlan let her be. Some instincts weren't his to override. He lit the lantern early that night. Shadows crawled longer across the walls. Every now and then, the fire popped sharp and loud. Each time, Harlan glanced toward the window, heart beating slow but loud. Then, a sound, far off. Not a howl, not a cry, a groan, low, ragged. It came once, like something had been wounded. Then silence, long enough to make him wonder if he'd imagined it. He whispered down to Pumpkin through the open door. "Tau giaroi, mavanso, kila ha." She didn't move. He left the door cracked just a little. Later, after the cabin had gone dark and only the stove's amber glow remained, he heard it again. Not the groan, not the wind, but a single thud, low, heavy, wood on wood, like someone had struck a tree once and waited. Not a warning, not a threat, just presence. The storm arrived without asking. It rolled down from the Sawtooth like a living thing, shouldering the ridges, swallowing the gaps between trees, turning the world into a white room with no walls. By dusk, the wind had sharpened its teeth. Snow drove sideways, biting skin through wool and denim alike. The temperature fell fast, 25 below freezing by the time Harlan fed another log into the stove. Colder still where the gusts knifed through the clearing and stole the heat straight from the breath. Inside the cabin, the fire burned red and steady, a stubborn heart in a chest of old timber. The iron stovetop hissed when he set the kettle down. His joints complained as he stood there listening. The roof creaked. The windows sang. Each sound had a place in his mind, a known shape. He moved by those sounds, slow and practiced, as if the night were something he could read by touch. Pumpkin hovered near the stairs, tail low, eyes wide. She didn't curl by the stove tonight. She stood, ears pivoting, the way animals do when they're trying to decide whether to trust the world or leave it behind. Harlan noticed. He always did. He said nothing. The wind surged, then fell away. The cabin shuddered once. He tightened the latch on the back door. A habit. He checked the lamp wick. Another habit. He poured himself a finger of whiskey and left it on the table untouched, the amber catching the firelight. He sat, waited. Then came the sound. Not the wind, not the trees. A thud against the front door, low, heavy, followed by a wet, dragged breath. Then another. Harlan's spine went rigid. He reached for the shotgun by the wall without standing, the motion smooth and old. He didn't point it. He just held it there, barrel down, finger nowhere near the trigger. The door shivered again, not from force, but from weight leaning into it, as if whatever was out there had no more strength to argue with the storm. Another breath, ragged, close. He rose, knees protesting, and crossed the room. Pumpkin hissed, a small sharp sound swallowed by the wind. He lifted his hand to calm her. His other hand found the latch. He paused. In the space between breaths, memory flared. A different night, a different storm, a choice he'd made too late. His chest tightened. He pressed his palm to the door, felt the cold seeping through the wood, the ache of it in his bones. He cracked the door. The storm shoved it wider. It lay there, collapsed across the threshold, fur matted with ice, shoulders hunched as if trying to make itself smaller. Its breath came in thick pulls, each one tearing. Frost clung to its lashes. Blood had frozen dark along its forearm, where the hair parted around a cruel groove that told a story without words. For a moment, only a moment, Harlan thought of closing the door, of sealing the warmth inside, of choosing safety. Then he saw the way the body had been arranged. Not sprawled, curled inward, careful, even in collapse. He opened the door all the way. The wind tore through the cabin, lifting ash, snapping the flames sideways. Harlan braced the door with his shoulder and set the shotgun down. He dragged the tarp from the wall, kicked the coil of rope loose with his boot, and worked with a grim, quiet urgency. He slid the tarp under the massive frame inch by inch, breath fogging, hands numb. He looped the rope, tied a knot that remembered him, and leaned back with his weight. The body shifted. Not a thrash, not a strike. Just a reflexive pull inward, elbows tucking, hands curling away from him, as if it knew the damage those hands could do and refused to let them fly. Harlan grunted and hauled again. His knees buckled. He reset, hauled. The tarp scraped over the floorboards, leaving a wet, dark trail. He dragged the body clear of the door and kicked it shut with his heel, slammed the latch home, leaned his forehead against the wood for a second longer than necessary. When he turned back, Pumpkin stood on the second step, back arched, tail bristled, eyes locked. She did not run. She did not scream. She held her ground like a thing that understood the stakes and chose to witness anyway. He pulled blankets from the chest, thick ones. He layered them, tucked them close. He fed the fire until the stove glowed and set a kettle of water on to warm. He poured honey into a mug, tipped a few drops of whiskey into it, not for courage, not for ritual, but because he'd learned long ago how to coax heat back into a body that wanted to give it up. He dipped a cloth into warm water and worked the ice from the fur with steady hands, not looking at the size of the shoulders, not counting the rise and fall of the chest, just doing the next right thing. The groove around the wrist told him the rest. Wire, fresh, the kind that bit deep and didn't care what it took with it. He felt anger move through him, slow and hot. He cut the matted hair back, cleaned the wound, wrapped it tight. The body flinched once, barely, then settled. When the eyes opened, they did not dart. They did not roll. They found him and held. There was no panic there. No animal terror. Just a measured, searching wait. As if it were taking his measure the way he'd taken the storms. Harlan swallowed. He didn't speak. He raised the mug, tipped it just enough that the warmth could be felt. Not forced. The eyes watched. The breath eased, a fraction. The fire snapped. The wind roared. Pumpkin crept down a step, then another, her movements precise. She stopped at the edge of the light and sat, tail wrapped around her paws, gaze never leaving the shape on the floor. Time stretched thin. Harlan worked until his hands shook, until the stove's heat pushed the chill back to the corners of the room. He sat on the floor when his legs gave out, back against the table, and stared at the ceiling while the storm beat itself against the cabin. At some point, he could not say when, the breathing changed, deeper, slower. The tension in the room eased its grip. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand and found it wet. He laughed once, a sound like bark splitting, then pressed his lips together. "Ju I jo song," he said to no one, the words barely a breath. "Lau roi tau moi lam lai." He slept in fits, head on his arm, waking every time the wind screamed or the fire popped. Each time the body was still there, warmth gathered under the blankets, the bandage clean. Once, in the dark, he felt movement, a careful shifting away from him, a deliberate restraint that spoke louder than any oath. Even in half-sleep, the thing refused to let its strength spill. Near dawn, the storm loosened its hold. The wind fell to a mutter. Snow drifted thick against the windows, a white hush pressing in. The cabin smelled of smoke and wet wool and honey. Harlan rose, stiff and slow. He added a log to the fire, then stood there, listening to the new quiet. Pumpkin moved closer to him now, brushing his leg, then sitting with her shoulder against his shin. He rested a hand on her head. She leaned into it, solid and warm. The eyes opened again. They tracked Pumpkin first. The body tensed, not to spring, but to contain. A tremor passed through the arm nearest the cat, the hand flexing, then stopping. The gaze slid back to Harlan. Recognition settled between them, heavy as snow on a bough. Harlan met the look. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't do anything at all except breathe and stay where he was. He let the room say the rest. Outside, the storm retreated up the mountain, leaving the world reshaped. Inside, the fire held, and something old and careful learned the rules of a small, stubborn house. Light found its way in through the frost-bitten windows, slow and gentle, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Outside, the storm had passed, but not without leaving a silence behind, the kind that sat heavy on the land, where not even the jays dared to cry out first. The snow hadn't melted. It had settled deeper in the night, a smooth, unbroken skin across the clearing. The world looked paused, as if it too were holding its breath for what came next. Inside the cabin, heat still clung to the bones of the place, thick and close. The fire had dulled to coals, breathing slow in the stove's iron belly. Harlan stirred from the corner where he'd slept half upright, a wool blanket still tangled around one knee. His eyes opened before his body moved. He listened first, as always. The floor creaked beneath shifting weight. Wood popped, the slow, scratchy sound of something breathing that wasn't him. The figure by the stove had changed in the night. It was no longer curled, no longer hiding in pain. It was sitting now, broad back hunched slightly, facing the warmth. One arm rested over its knee, the other hanging limp, wrapped still in the bandage he'd tied before his hands gave out. The fur on its shoulder glistened, cleaner than yesterday. As the firelight moved, so did the muscles beneath the skin, quiet, restrained, alive. Harlan didn't speak, just pushed himself upright, joints protesting. He watched the slow lift of the creature's chest as it breathed, the subtle tilt of its head. It hadn't turned to look at him. It was listening too. maybe waiting. He moved to the stove, tossed in 2 small logs. Flame licked up obediently. The light bounced off the figure's thick fur, turning parts of it bronze. He ladled water into the kettle, set it down, and glanced toward the stairs. Pumpkin was not where she should have been. He found her sitting on the 3rd step, upright, alert. Her tail curled tightly around her paws, her amber eyes narrowed and locked on the shape by the fire. The tension hadn't left her, but she hadn't run. Harlan nodded once, like to a fellow soldier, then turned back to the counter. He made breakfast the way he always did. 2 eggs, a strip of bacon, a bit of stew from the kettle he'd kept going. The spoon clanked softly against the cast iron. The smell began to fill the air, salt and meat and heat. Behind him, he heard movement, not fast, not wild, just the sound of a body shifting. He looked over his shoulder and found it watching him now. Eyes darker than coal, fixed and level. The breath came easier now, steadier. The cut at its wrist was wrapped with one of his old flannel strips, clean, dry. The creature did not touch it, did not scratch, just watched. He grabbed another bowl, piled it high. He didn't offer it like a gift, just set it down 2 feet away on the floor, then moved back to his own seat. The creature waited a beat, then leaned forward, hands slow, fingers long and scarred, careful. It picked up the food not like a wild thing, but like a soldier in the woods, methodical, quiet. It ate quickly, not greedily. It didn't drop scraps, didn't break the bowl. Every motion precise. Pumpkin watched everything. When the last bite was gone, the creature sat back on its heels, looked at him again, then turned slightly, just enough that it could face the stove without turning its back on him. The gesture wasn't fear, it was respect. And then, almost too quiet to catch, it made a sound. Not a word, not yet, but something closer to breath than growl, like it was trying to soften the edge between them. Harlan blinked. The moment stretched between them like thread. Then Pumpkin jumped down. It was a small sound. Light. The soft tap of her paws on old pine. But it was enough. The creature's head turned sharp. And instinct, old and carved into its bones, rose. It moved fast. Too fast. A lunge. Not toward Harlan. Not toward the door. Toward the cat. One swipe. One leap. A blur of fur and power. A low, guttural sound ripped from its throat. Not hate, reflex. The way wolves chase birds without thinking. The way fear lashes out before the mind catches up. Pumpkin hissed, darted under the table. And Harlan, heart slamming against his ribs, reached for the first thing in reach. The poker. He didn't yell words, just a sharp broken sound. The iron struck fur. Not hard enough to break, but sharp enough to stop. The creature froze. Then it stepped back, hands up, breath ragged. It did not snarl, did not growl. It backed into the corner by the woodpile and sank down. Shoulders hunched, chin low, arms wrapped around its knees. And then it lowered its head. The breath that came next was not rage, it was regret. Harlan held the poker still, but his arm trembled now, not from fear, but from everything else rising up behind it. The creature looked at Pumpkin, then down, then again. That sound. Softer this time, not like breath, like apology. Not perfect, not human, but unmistakable. It sounded like shame. Pumpkin edged out from under the table, slow. Her tail twitched. She stared hard, then turned to Harlan, rubbed against his leg once, not for comfort, for recognition. He looked down at her, then at the creature. The poker dropped with a dull clang. He walked over, knelt, slow, until he was eye level with the shape in the corner. He tapped his chest once. "Family," he pointed to Pumpkin. She flicked her ear but stayed still. Then he pointed at the creature. No. No anger, no punishment, just the rule. The creature didn't look up, but it nodded. The movement small, honest. They didn't speak again that morning, not in words. The day passed heavy with the weight of almosts. The sky stayed gray. Snow held. Harlan did chores like always. Gathered wood, chopped slowly, one knee braced. Pumpkin followed him as usual. The creature stayed inside, but didn't touch anything. Just sat near the stove, eyes tracking him through the window. That night, Harlan didn't chain the door. He didn't need to. When darkness wrapped the cabin again, he found the shape still curled in its corner. Not sleeping, not hiding, just waiting. Pumpkin curled near the stair again. Still tense, but still there. He left a blanket, filled the stove, lit the lamp low, went to bed without locking anything. In the middle of the night, something woke him. A sound outside. Not close, but not distant either. Footsteps. Not rushed. Measured. He slipped from bed, moved to the window. Something moved beyond the clearing. It did not enter, did not test the porch. Just stood. Long enough to be seen, then gone. He stepped outside with nothing but his coat on, breath billowing. The stars had come out. The snow sparkled. But there were no new tracks, only the ones that stopped at the edge of what could be called home. And he understood then that it hadn't left. It had only stepped back. Not out of fear, but out of discipline. He stood there long after the cold reached his knees, long after the wind picked up again, then turned and walked back in, where fire and breath and something unspoken waited. And the rules of the cabin, of kindness, of boundaries, of family, had been tested and held. But winter wasn't over, and the forest, though silent, had already started watching. The thaw didn't arrive like a celebration. It came quietly, like someone unlatching a gate after months of snow, like the slow crack of river ice as it let go of its grip on the rocks beneath. One morning, Harlan stepped out onto his porch and heard something he hadn't heard in months. A drip. Steady, soft. Meltwater running off the eaves and hitting the old tin bucket he left out without thinking. A sound older than memory. Simple as breathing. The trees had shed their winter silence. A few birds had come back, cautious in their song. Mud clung to the boots now, thick and heavy. And the wind no longer sliced. It whispered. He marked the date in his notebook without ceremony. March 26th, first thaw. Sweet feeder visited. Knees still stiff. He glanced toward the tree line, where the snow had pulled back like a curtain, exposing the packed earth of the path he'd carved one shovel width at a time. He stood there a long while, staring at the edge of the woods. Not waiting, just listening. Something had been there the night before. Again, not close, but near enough that the snow still held the memory of wide, deep footprints circling the cabin. Not through it, not breaking the invisible line between them. Just passing through. Watching, keeping distance. He didn't erase them. Didn't even step near. He split wood with more care now. Not because of his back. Because he'd found 2 logs days earlier, already split clean, laid neatly near the pile. No axe, no footprints. Just a quiet trade in the old code of the woods, help for help. A kind of language men had forgotten how to speak. That afternoon, while clearing branches off the narrow game trail behind the East Ridge, he found the carcass of a young elk, not torn to pieces, dragged deliberately away from the main path. Flies hadn't touched it. Neither had wolves, as if something had removed it not for food, but to protect something else from coming closer. The snow near it was disturbed. Long heel prints, a sweep of thick fur. He followed them with his eyes, then stopped. They led away from the trail, not toward the cabin. He felt it in his chest before he could explain it in his head. She'd come back, not to say thank you, but to protect. Pumpkin padded out onto the porch that evening, sniffed the wind, then sat near the edge where the shadow of the pines crept close. She didn't hiss, didn't chase, just watched, tail flicking once, as if she too understood that the world outside had changed in some small, permanent way. Later that week, Harlan took the long way down to the creek, boots sucking in the soft earth, knees complaining with every incline. He found new signs near the bend where the blackberries grew in summer. A mark carved into a tree trunk, 3 long, vertical scrapes. Not random, not clawed in rage. Deliberate, clean. A message he didn't fully grasp, but understood enough not to cross. He placed a rock at its base. Small, smooth. The way she had once placed venison near his porch. Offered, not forced. A way of saying, I saw this, and I'll leave it be. That night, the stars came out early. The wind died. And from somewhere deep beyond the ridge, he heard a knocking sound, 3 times, like wood striking wood. Then silence. Not warning. Not threat. Acknowledgement. At Mabel's diner, talk had started up again. Spring always brought fresh rumors. Mountain things, early bear sightings, tracks too big to make sense. Bo had been in twice that week, asking questions he pretended were about rabbits. Tessa, too, had come by the porch once, asking casually if he'd seen any steel traps in the area. He hadn't answered, not directly, but he'd seen her eyes linger on the old flannel bandage he'd tossed in the burn barrel. She knew more than she said, and maybe that was enough. When the next rain fell, it came sudden and thick, turning the paths to soup. Harlan waited it out inside, whittling down scraps of cedar into useless little shapes. He carved one into a smooth ring and set it on the table near Pumpkin. She ignored it, like always. That night, he heard rustling. Not at the porch, at the back of the cabin. He rose, slow, lantern in hand. The light reached the edge of the trees. Nothing. But in the morning, something had changed. The path to the shed had been cleared. Not by wind, by hand, or something like it. Branches moved, stones shifted. Not random, organized, intentional. It was the first time he smiled in weeks. He wrote it down without thinking. April 11th, path cleared, Pumpkin calm. I'm not alone. The next time he went to the creek, he found a boot print. Human. Not his, not Bo's. It was near the tree where the scrape had been marked. The footprint had a pattern in the sole. Vibram, like the kind sold cheap at Rusty's Hardware. That night he sat up long after the fire had gone low. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew what it meant. Someone else had come. Not the kind that left stones or carried regret. The kind that left wire. Tessa showed up 2 mornings later. Mud on her pants. A rifle slung over one shoulder. She didn't knock. Just called out once and waited. He opened the door without asking. West Trail, she said. 2 snares, one fresh, one sprung and bloody. He didn't answer. I'm not putting it in my report, she said, eyes steady. Why not? He asked finally. Because it'd bring more boots out here, she said. And because I saw something I wasn't supposed to. He looked at her, the quiet between them full of all the things they weren't saying. Whatever it was, she added, it didn't kill. No, he said, it didn't. She left without saying goodbye. Bo came by the next evening, muddy and nervous. Brought a jar of jam from his mother. Sat on the porch without being invited. His legs dangled off the edge like a kid still too light for gravity. There's a man in town, he said after a long silence. Says he's a guide. Wants to know the trails. Keeps buying jerky and asking about creek paths. What did you tell him? Harlan asked. Nothing, Bo said. But he bought me a soda. Harlan looked at him. I didn't take it, the boy added quickly. Didn't want to owe him. Smart. That night, Harlan checked every window before he slept. Not out of fear, out of principle. 2 days later, he found another marker. This time farther east, near the split trail. Same 3 lines, but older, like it had been there longer than he realized. He stood beside it a long time, then reached into his coat, pulled out his notebook, and scribbled one line. No kong fei je trabang loi, no la je song tot hon. He closed the book, tucked it back into his coat, and walked the long way home. When he reached the clearing, Pumpkin was waiting. At the edge of the yard, just before the first stone that marked the unspoken border, lay a single branch, curved, stripped of bark, shaped like a question mark. It hadn't fallen. It had been placed. He didn't pick it up. Didn't need to. Sometimes the answer isn't a word. Sometimes it's knowing someone else is watching the same road and choosing not to cross unless they're invited. And somewhere, just past the line of trees, she stood, not asking for anything, not offering apology, just watching like him, waiting for what came next. But not from fear, from something older, quieter, and far harder to earn: respect. The heat didn't ease in gently that year. It pressed down hard, early, without warning, bleaching the edges of pine needles, lifting the smell of dry earth from the hills, cracking the last of the snowmelt into dust. The wind carried grit. The birds stayed low. Something in the mountains had turned quiet again, but not with snow this time. With watching, Harlan noticed it first in the air. He could feel it in his joints, not just the ache of weather but of pressure, like something was building underground, just waiting for a spark to split it open. And in town, people had started whispering the way they did when something unfamiliar brushed the edge of what they thought they knew. Mabel's diner was packed more than usual for June. Not with tourists, those hadn't come yet, but locals who came in for coffee and stayed for rumor. It started with a freezer full of venison gone bad at the Harper Ranch, then missing chickens, then a hunter swearing up and down he saw eyes shine at him 8 feet off the ground, just past Moonlight Creek. Nobody said the word out loud at first, but they all thought it. The town wanted something to explain what they couldn't name, something to blame for the fear they didn't understand. And fear always found a shape if you waited long enough. That shape walked through the front door of Mabel's 2 days later. Tall, dusty boots. No smile. His name was Duke Hanlon, but he didn't give it. Not at first. He bought a beer, asked about trails, offered to trade a freezer for elk meat. Said he was passing through but lingered long enough to be noticed. He had a way of watching people that didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like measurement. He wore clean shirts, but his hands were calloused and his eyes scanned maps like they were memory. Mabel clocked him the first hour and kept a short leash on the conversation. Tessa, when she saw him from across the street, made a mental note to walk the east boundary of the national forest more often. Bo was the first to talk to him. 12 years old, curious, no real training in distrust yet. Duke handed him a soda and asked if he knew where the old mine trail cut past the bend in the creek. Bo nodded, too eager. He didn't give directions right away. But he didn't say no either. And then, 2 days later, Pumpkin disappeared. Harlan didn't panic when he noticed. She'd wandered off before. Cats did that. Sometimes she chased birds, disappeared behind the shed for a nap in the shade, came back with leaves in her whiskers. But that night, when the stars came out and the clearing went quiet, she wasn't on the porch. He walked the edge of the cabin with a lantern. Called out once, nothing. In the morning he found her at the tree line, alive, but with a thin nylon string knotted clumsily around her neck, frayed like it had been cut in a rush. She limped slightly. Her fur was ruffled, her ears flattened. But she didn't run from him. She let him pick her up. She buried her face in his shirt and shook once. He said nothing, just held her, took her inside, shut the door. That same morning, a storm moved in. Not with rain, but with people. Hunters, men in trucks. A pair of young ones asking if permits were required past the old fire trail. They didn't bring bows or fishing poles. They brought binoculars and GoPros and high-caliber rifles. Someone had told them something, and Harlan didn't need to guess who. That afternoon, he went up to the ridge where the old woodpile had been stacked last winter. Not to look for her, but to listen, and she came. Not loud, not close, but present. A shadow moving just beyond where the wind bent the tall grass. A shape that paused when he did. That didn't hide. Just waited. He didn't turn. He set down what he brought instead. 2 apples, 1 wool glove he hadn't worn in years, and the photograph. It was old. Faded. A picture of him and Helen, standing by a trail sign before it had rusted through. She had her hand on his back. He was laughing. He didn't leave the photo as bait. He left it as a reminder. If the forest was keeping score, it deserved to know what loss looked like. That night, he woke near midnight. Not to sound, but to feeling. He walked outside barefoot, the ground warm from the day. And the photo was gone, the apples untouched. But in their place, neatly arranged, were 4 small objects: a metal button, a scrap of blue flannel, a child's marble, the kind they didn't make anymore, and a silver fork, not clean, old, bent at the prongs. He gathered them one by one, slow, held them like a man picking through memory, took them inside, laid them on the table. Pumpkin watched from the window. Her ears didn't twitch. Later, when Bo came by to ask if he could borrow Harlan's old lantern, he hesitated on the porch. "You ever seen something out there?" the boy asked. "That feels like it's watching you. But not to hurt you?" Harlan looked at him. Bo swallowed. "I think I told that man too much." Harlan didn't lecture, didn't scold, just reached out and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Dung lai kip luk, la dung ki." Bo blinked, then nodded, took the lantern, left without another word. By the following Sunday, the town was buzzing. Duke had told a few folks he had a lead on something rare in the hills. Said he had proof, footage, tracks, sounds. He didn't show it. Just let the words do the damage, and people believed. They always did when the hunger was bigger than the truth. Sheriff Vance came by the diner, ordered coffee, said nothing about Duke, but his eyes lingered too long on the map by the counter, the one that marked off-grid cabins, the one with Harlan's clearing circled in pencil. That night, a sound rose from the woods. Deep, resonant, rhythmic. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Then silence. Not a threat, a call, a gathering, like drums before a war. And Harlan stood on his porch, hand resting on Pumpkin's head, breath slow and even. Somewhere out there, something was moving. Not just one, not just her. Others, the ones that didn't want to be known. That had rules. That had waited long enough for the cold to pass and the game to change. And the town, hungry for stories, starved for blame, had started lighting matches in the dry brush of the old wild. It wasn't just about tracks anymore. It was about territory, and territory always had guardians. It started with smoke, not the kind that curled soft from cabin chimneys or rose gentle from meat on a summer grill. This smoke was dry and fast, no scent of comfort in it, just warning. A line along the southern sky, thin at first, like someone had drawn a blade across the horizon, then thicker, darker, moving. By noon, the sun had turned red behind a curtain of heat and ash. Leaves hung limp on their branches. Even the birds had gone quiet. The forest, so alive days before, now waited like it remembered this kind of danger. Tessa Holt had been walking perimeter when she saw the first tongues of flame skip across the ridgeline. It wasn't lightning. This had been set, deliberate. The brush had been cleared in a way no lightning strike ever would. Too clean, too precise. When she radioed it in, the frequency crackled with static. Then came the overlapping voices. Stanley's volunteer crew already scrambling, the Forest Service confirming at least 3 ignition points. Wind from the south, unpredictable terrain. 2 hikers possibly unaccounted for near Devil's Fork. By the time Tessa made it back to her truck, the fire was running, fast, downhill, punching through saplings like paper. She grabbed her pack, slammed the door, and gunned it back toward town, dust trailing her like smoke's younger brother. At Harlan's cabin, the air had changed before the trees even showed it. The birds gone, the silence different. Pumpkin had been the first to act, restless at the door, ears back, tail flicking like a metronome set too fast. Harlan felt it too, deep in his chest, an ache that didn't belong to age this time. He didn't wait. He packed the essentials without panic, just his hands moving where they'd learned to go. Notebook, flashlight, water. The old windbreaker Helen had worn that last summer. Pumpkin's leash, though he didn't expect her to use it. The smoke reached the clearing before the sirens did. Low, rolling, like breath before a roar. Then, voices, not human. He stepped out and saw her, Mara, standing at the edge of the tree line, unmoving, the smoke curling around her legs. Not afraid, just watching. Her fur dark with ash, but her stance steady. A quiet authority in her stillness. She looked past him, not at him, toward the ridge, toward the fire, then back. Not a gesture, not a plea, a signal. He understood and followed. He didn't speak, just moved, pumpkin at his heels, pack slung over one shoulder. The heat bit harder the farther they walked. The trees closed in, smoke pressing from above. But Mara walked as if the air belonged to her. She didn't stumble. She didn't look back. She led them not toward safety, toward someone else. Halfway up the ridge, near the split trail that rarely saw boots, Harlan heard it. A cry. Small, sharp, cut off too quick. Mara stopped, looked at him, and in that glance was the rule. Don't let them see you afraid. He pushed forward through a stand of brush and found it. A shape. Small, curled against a cleft in the rock. Fur lighter, eyes wide, breathing fast. A young one. No more than 4 feet tall. Arm tucked, leg twisted. Not bleeding, just frozen. It had not yet seen him, but it had seen fire, and Mara stood between them, blocking the heat, body braced, not touching, just shielding. Harlan didn't ask how long they'd been there. He knelt, slow, knees sinking into ash. He didn't reach for the child. He reached for a stone nearby, warm from the smoke, and rolled it closer, slow. Then another. A path. He waited, and the child, on trembling limbs, crawled. Not to him, toward her. Mara stepped aside, let it pass, then looked back at him, then toward the north trail, toward town, toward the one still out there. He hesitated. That trail was steep, the air there was thick, and somewhere someone might still be alive, or dead, or waiting. He made the choice that had eluded him once, long ago, when snow and grief had frozen him at the wheel. He moved. Mara took the child, vanished behind smoke. Harlan climbed, each breath harder, each step hotter. The fire hadn't reached that section of ridge yet, but it would. He found the boy near the overlook, Bo, coughing, arm scraped, eyes red. The map he'd carried fluttered in the wind. I got turned around, Bo gasped. I thought I saw a shortcut, then the smoke. Harlan didn't answer, just pulled him to his feet. They moved fast, down the trail Mara had marked earlier that spring with 3 stones in a triangle. A path only those who paid attention would have seen. A path that bent around the ridge, down through granite, through a gap the fire couldn't find. When they reached the base, Bo collapsed, coughing, gasping, and from the edge of the clearing, a shape emerged. Sheriff Vance, rifle in one hand, radio in the other, ash across his face. He saw them, all of them. Bo! Harlan. And, behind them, for one moment, Mara. She didn't run. She stood, met his eyes, then turned, and disappeared into the smoke. Vance didn't speak, didn't raise the rifle. He turned to Harlan, jaw tight. "Get the boy out," he said. Harlan nodded. Later, when the fire was declared under control, the cause was listed as unknown. But those who'd been there, really been there, knew. Someone had said it, used the chaos. Duke had not been seen since that morning, until the following week, when a deputy found an old steel trap clamped around his ankle, blood dried in the dirt, and the man half-conscious from dehydration. He said nothing of what he saw, only that he'd lost the trail. The trap was old, rusted, but well-placed, the kind that only someone who knew the land would have laid. Vance filed the report, quietly. No charges pressed, no press release, just a line in a notebook. Resolved, no further action. And Harlan, weeks later, when the last of the smoke cleared, stood once more on his porch, pumpkin at his feet. The child hadn't come back, but sometimes, near dusk, a second shadow moved just behind Mara's, smaller, quicker, still learning. Harlan didn't wave, didn't speak, but once he left a stone on the porch railing, round, smooth, And the next morning, it was gone. The first red leaf drifted down the morning after the rain. It landed on the porch railing, wet and curled, as if it hadn't quite decided whether to let go or hang on. Harlan saw it from the window while tying off a bundle of dry thyme, the twine biting softly into his knuckles. It was a sign the forest always gave first, long before the tourists noticed color on the ridges, long before Mabel swapped out her summer pie specials for pumpkin and apple spice. Pumpkin herself was already curled in the one warm sun patch near the door, as she always did when the air turned sharp before noon. She lifted her head once, ears twitching toward the trees. Harlan didn't turn to look. He just waited, breath held for no reason at all. There'd been peace for weeks now, but peace wasn't the same as safety. It never was. He felt it first before he saw it, a sound that didn't belong to the forest. The soft purr of a car engine on old gravel, far too cautious, unfamiliar with the way the road tilted just before the last bend. He walked out slow, wiping his hands on his shirt. Dust curled behind the tires of a faded Buick that had no business being this far up a logging path. And when the car door opened, he felt his breath stop and forget how to return. The woman who stepped out was in her 40s now, her hair longer than before, pulled back in the way her mother used to wear it. Her boots were city clean but sturdy. She didn't look lost. She looked like someone who had driven a very long way to ask one question she wasn't sure had an answer. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She stared at the cabin, then at him, then past him, toward the trees. He nodded once, like an apology, and opened the door. Inside, she didn't take off her coat. She walked the room like she remembered it only in pieces, tracing her hand across the shelf near the stove, glancing at the window she used to watch for deer through as a child. Her fingers paused at the nail where Helen's green scarf had once hung. It wasn't there now. Pumpkin padded into the room, glanced at her, blinked, then turned back to the fire with indifference. "Fire season," she said at last, voice dry. "They said there was one near here. I saw your name in the paper. I thought maybe—" He poured coffee into a mug without asking. Set it on the table. She didn't touch it. "You never wrote back," she said, not accusing, just saying it aloud. "I didn't know what to say." "You could have said you were still alive." He nodded. The silence wasn't angry. It was older than that. Tired. Made of all the things not said during holidays missed, during calls unanswered, during the years when grief was something they each carried like a different language. "I thought you picked the forest over us," she said. "I didn't pick anything," he answered. "I just stayed." She looked at the floor, then at him. Her eyes softened, just a shade. "I thought you'd be harder, angrier." "I was," he said. She moved toward the back window, looked out. "You always said there were rules out here. Things people didn't understand. There are. Are they why you've never told me what you really do in this place?" He didn't answer, and she didn't push. Later that afternoon, she brought out a small metal bowl from her duffel, walked it to the edge of the clearing, not to the tree line, just the edge, filled it with water from her canteen. She placed it there gently, didn't speak, then turned back to the cabin without looking behind her. Pumpkin followed her halfway, then returned to the porch, watching the woods as if waiting for approval. That evening, Harlan sat on the steps, his daughter beside him. They didn't touch, but their elbows almost brushed. "Does she come back?" she asked. He nodded. "How often?" "When she wants to." She didn't ask more. She just looked into the trees, the way he did, long and slow and silent. Then the wind changed. It carried something with it. Not scent, not sound. A presence. And she felt it too. He saw it in the way her shoulders tensed. Then, a rustle, far off. Not a deer, not squirrel. A wait. She looked at him, startled. He didn't move. She held still. A branch cracked. And then nothing. Later that night, she whispered before sleep, "I think I understand why you stayed." He didn't reply, just closed his eyes. Somewhere in the dark, a pair of eyes blinked once, then vanished. The next morning, Duke came back, Not limping anymore, but not smiling either. He showed up at the edge of town, talking quiet in the corner of Rusty's Hardware, asking for new trail maps, said he had fresh leads. Brought a man with him this time, thin, younger, with a handheld video recorder and a hungry look in his eyes. Bo heard them whispering outside the post office. They mentioned a child, a smaller one, said the fire hadn't burned through everything, that the real story still lived in the trees. Sheriff Vance found Duke that afternoon behind the diner, leaning against the loading dock. You planning to start another fire, or just poke at the one that didn't kill you? Duke grinned, but there was nothing friendly in it. This time, I'll bring proof. Proof of what? Whatever it is you've all been hiding. You got a permit? I got curiosity. You know what happens when that burns too hot? Duke tilted his head. You go blind before you go warm. The sheriff walked off without saying more. That night, Harlan's daughter stayed up late, sat at the kitchen table, looking at the old photo albums, the ones she'd sworn she never wanted to touch again. She found a picture of her as a child, standing near a tree that looked oddly familiar. The bark had 3 long vertical lines carved into it. She stared at it for a long time, then slid it across the table to him. You carved this? He shook his head. No. Then who did? He didn't answer. Just poured her more tea. That night a shape stepped from the woods. Mara. She came close to the edge of the clearing but didn't cross. She looked not at Harlan, but at the daughter, who had walked out alone. Not far, just enough to be seen. She didn't flinch, didn't run. Mara stood still, then struck a nearby dead branch with her hand. One swift blow, breaking it clean, then lowered her arm, and stood motionless again. The daughter didn't scream. She watched, then slowly, just barely, nodded. Behind Mara, a second shape waited, shorter, smaller, watching. Then, without a sound, they vanished, back into the dark, and the woman on the porch whispered a word she hadn't used in years. Dad! In the morning, Duke came with 3 men, rifles, cameras, maps, and a piece of fur he swore was real. He said he would end it, once and for all, but something in his voice sounded like desperation, and Harlan knew he wasn't hunting discovery, he was hunting revenge. The first snow fell before sunrise, light as breath. It blanketed the clearing in a silence so deep it made every footstep feel too loud, every exhale a betrayal. The cold didn't arrive like a thief. It came with purpose, slow, deliberate, sinking into every branch, every roof tile, every memory. By the time the town of Stanley stirred awake, the forest beyond it had already sealed its secrets beneath a thin crust of white. At Harlan's cabin, the woodpile was already stacked high, the kettle warm on the stove, but the warmth inside couldn't push back the unease that had crept in over the last 48 hours. The air wasn't just cold. It was watching. Duke was moving again. He'd returned with more than just threats this time. He brought maps, names, stories, printed evidence, and promises whispered into the ears of anyone who'd listen. But this morning, he brought people. 3 of them. Big cameras, camouflage, the smell of adrenaline and false heroism. They weren't hunters in the old sense. They weren't looking for meat or challenge. They were looking for footage, shock, fame. And Duke had one goal, to drag what lived in the forest into the light and then sell it to the highest bidder. He didn't want to kill. Not at first. He wanted them alive, scared, exposed. He knew where to look now, not just near the ridge. Near the child, the younger one they'd whispered about at Rusty's. He knew what would draw her out, so he baited it. And what he used wasn't food, it was threat. That morning, just after dawn, he and his crew crossed into the woods armed with motion sensors, rope nets, a tranquilizer gun he'd paid too much for in Boise, and a plan so cruel it didn't even look like cruelty on paper. Just calculation. He would injure the small one, not kill. Just enough to make the big one come running. And when she did, he'd capture them both. Harlan felt the shift in the wind before the first shot rang out. Not the kind that echoed wide and sharp. The other kind. Subtle. Suppressed. Not meant to kill. Meant to provoke. He stepped out onto the porch just as Pumpkin bolted upright. Tail bristled. The trees weren't moving, but the mountain was waking up. His daughter stepped outside a moment later, her eyes wide. "You feel that?" He nodded. They didn't speak again as they grabbed coats and packs. Didn't need to. Some truths didn't wait for discussion. They just demanded presence. At the edge of the trail, they paused. Fresh snow, and in it, a set of prints. Large. Not running, but leading. Harlan followed. Not because he was brave, but because someone had to. And he wasn't alone. Halfway up the old fire trail, Sheriff Vance stepped out from behind a fallen cedar, rifle in hand, face unreadable. "You know what's coming." "I do," Harlan said. Vance looked toward the slope. "I'll slow them down." "You won't stop them." "No," he said, "but I can make sure no one else joins them." The meaning was clear. No backup, no media, no rescue, just silence. And the rules of the forest. Harlan kept walking. At the ridge, the tracks split. Lighter ones veered right. He followed. Through smoke from the last fire's echo. Through the hush of pine. Then he saw her. Mara, standing tall, still, eyes burning. Not with fear, but with focus. And behind her, small, hunched, breathing fast, the child. Injured, a leg dragged, a smear of blood on the snow like spilled paint. Then the sound of boots. Duke appeared first. Not rushing, savoring. He saw them. Mara, the child, and Harlan. He lifted the tranq rifle, cool as stone. "Back away," he said. "You don't want this. You don't understand what you're about to start," Harlan said. "Oh, I do," Duke answered. "Better than you think." He raised the rifle, and that's when Harlan did it. He stepped in front of Mara. Between her and the shot, between the camera and the truth. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He just said one word. "Family." The air went still. Even the birds hushed. Mara didn't move, didn't roar, didn't lash. But the child made a sound, a whimper, sharp, scared. Instinct flared. She stepped forward and saw Pumpkin. She hadn't seen the cat until now. The orange shape huddled at Harlan's ankle, eyes wide, soft. And in that instant, Mara, powerful, ancient, wounded, flinched. Her hand twitched toward the child, toward the cat, then stopped. "Midair," her breath caught, and slowly. She lowered her arm, not out of defeat, but of choice. She looked at Harlan, then at Duke. Her body trembled once, then calmed. She stepped over the child, placing herself between the small one and the rifle. And then, unbelievably, she lowered her head. Not to submit, but to say something wordless, a vow. Then turned to face Duke fully. No growl, no strike, just those eyes, and something in them. Shamed him. He didn't shoot. Couldn't. The camera kept rolling, but the story had slipped out of his hands. Vance arrived moments later. He didn't look at Mara. He looked at Duke. "You're done." Duke tried to speak, tried to show proof. The fur, the print photos, the footage. Vance didn't flinch. "You trespassed. You baited wildlife. You brought fire. You laid traps. You endangered a child. But it's not. It's enough." He signaled to his deputies. Mara didn't wait. She stepped backward, never turning, and at the clearing's edge, she stopped, raised her hand. Not in mimicry, not in mockery, in something else. Acknowledgement, then vanished. No word, no cry, just snow swallowing her steps. Later, as the light faded and the wind shifted again, Harlan sat on the porch, Pumpkin beside him. His daughter came out with tea. No questions, only quiet. And then, from the woods, a shadow. Mara, alone. She walked to the edge of the porch and stopped. Did not cross. She touched the wood post gently. Fingers splayed. Then pressed her hand to her chest and lowered her head, then turned and left. No drama, no goodbye. Just one last sign of honor, of memory, of something returned. And as the snow began to fall again, covering her prints before Harlan could memorize them, he felt something settle inside him. Not relief, not triumph, something quieter. Peace. Pumpkin cowered closer, her body soft, no longer tense. And Harlan whispered, more to the wind than to himself. Kindness. isn't wasted. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with a silence that changes you. A silence so full, so alive, it feels like the forest is still speaking, just in a language we've forgotten how to hear. In a world that often rewards noise, speed, and proof, it's easy to forget that some of the truest things we'll ever know are the ones we can't measure. A quiet act of mercy. A choice to stand still instead of strike. The decision to see someone, not as a threat, but as a mirror. And in that moment, something ancient stirs. Not in the trees, not in the mountains, but in us. Because maybe the real question has never been what is out there. Maybe it's who are we when no one's watching? And what are we willing to protect, even when no one will ever know we did? We live in a time where proof is king. But kindness doesn't ask for proof. It just leaves its mark in the quiet. In the stories we don't tell to impress, but to remember. In the way we treat what we don't understand. In the way we return something sacred back to the dark, just so it can keep shining. And maybe that's the point. Not everything needs to be captured. Not everything is meant to be known. Some things are only meant to be witnessed, with reverence. So if this story left you feeling something hard to name but impossible to shake, maybe that's not by accident. Maybe it's a reminder that even in the loneliest places, where the road ends and the forest begins, there is still a kind of grace, watching, waiting, asking nothing, but offering everything. Thank you for spending time in this quiet corner of the world with us. If this story touched something in you, we'd love to know. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? What stayed with you? And if you believe stories like this matter, stories of compassion, of quiet courage, of the things that still live wild and true, consider subscribing. It helps us keep this flame alive. Until next time, take care of one another. And remember, kindness is never wasted.